Of course. Here is a complete YouTube story in 3 parts based on your request. Part 1. The Smoke of a Bitter Memory. The heat of a Texas summer in 1943 was a physical entity, a blistering, shimmering force that rose off the dusty grounds of Camp Crockett and baked the very soul of the place. For Sergeant Isabella Bella Rossi of the Women's Army Corps, the relentless sun was a pale imitation of the fire she carried inside her. Her world was one of numbers, of neat columns in a ledger, of supply requisitions and inventory control. As the quartermaster for this sprawling prisoner of war camp, she brought a quiet, fierce order to the chaos. But her own heart was a landscape of disorder, scorched by a single, folded piece of paper she kept in the pocket of her uniform. It was a telegram that began with the 5 words that had cleaved her life in 2. The Secretary of War regrets. Her fiancé, a kind-hearted rancher's son from West Texas named Jack, had been killed in the mountains of Italy, a victim of the same army whose men she was now tasked with clothing and feeding. Her Italian surname, once a source of cheerful pride, a connection to a heritage of art. Food and family now felt like an accusation. To men like Sergeant Walt Brody, the burly, cynical head of the camp guards, her name was reason enough for suspicion. Brody had seen the brutal fighting in Sicily firsthand, and he had come home with a leg full of shrapnel and a heart full of unadulterated hatred for all things Italian. The arrival of the first Italian POWs at Camp Crockett was a spectacle that drew the entire nearby town of Meridian. Springs to the railroad tracks! They watched in stunned silence as hundreds of young men in tattered, sun-bleached uniforms were marched off the train cars. These weren't the goose-stepping fascists from the newsreels. They were skinny, dark-eyed, and exhausted, looking more like lost boys than the proud soldiers of Mussolini's new Roman Empire. They stared at the vast, empty Texas landscape with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Life in the camp was a tense, monotonous routine until a directive arrived from the War Department that felt to Bella like a cruel joke. The government was launching an experimental program, an attempt to use American culture as a tool of de-fascistization. The idea was to expose the prisoners to the American way of life, to show them the fruits of a free and prosperous society. The program was to begin with a quintessential American cultural experience. A full-scale, authentic Texas Smokehouse BBQ, Captain Harris, the camp's thoughtful but overwhelmed commander, gave Bella the assignment. "Sergeant Rossi," he'd said, avoiding her eyes, "I know this is difficult, but you're the best quartermaster I've got. I need you to organize this. Requisition the supplies, coordinate with the cooks, the works." Bella stood before him, her face a pale, unreadable mask. She thought of Jack, who had loved the slow-smoked brisket from the smokehouse in his hometown. He had promised to take her there after the war. Now, she was being ordered to recreate that cherished memory, that taste of home and happiness, for the very men who had stolen her future. The news of the barbecue ignited a firestorm of outrage among the American staff. In the enlisted mess, Sergeant Brody held court, his voice a low, angry growl. "A barbecue?" He spat, the words dripping with contempt. "We're gonna smoke briskets for these spaghetti-bending cowards? I watched my friend Tony bleed to death in a Sicilian olive grove, and now we're gonna be serving his killers potato salad?" His furious eyes found Bella as she was reviewing the weekly menus. A nasty smile twisted his lips. "Hey, Rossi," he called out, his voice silencing the room. "You must be in heaven. Planning a big party for your paisans? You can serve 'em up some of that famous Texas hospitality. Maybe teach 'em a thing or two about how real men eat." The implication was clear, the insult twofold, a jab at her heritage and her gender. Bella felt a familiar hot coil of anger tighten in her stomach. She could feel the weight of every suspicious glance, every whispered comment about the Italian girl in charge of supplies. But to show her anger was to show weakness. She turned to face him, her gaze as steady and cool as a winter morning. "My orders, Sergeant Brody," she said, her voice even and professional, "are to organize a meal. Your orders are to guard the prisoners. I suggest you focus on your job, and I'll focus on mine." She turned her back on him, a gesture of dismissal that was more powerful than any angry retort. But inside, her resolve was crumbling. The next few days were a special kind of hell. She signed the requisitions for whole beef briskets, for massive pork shoulders, for crates of corn, beans, and potatoes. She arranged for the construction of a large earthen barbecue pit, just like the ones used at local festivals. Every detail she organized was a fresh stab of grief, a desecration of a sacred memory. The day of the barbecue was hot and still. A smoky haze, fragrant with hickory wood and roasting meat, drifted across the entire camp. The Italian prisoners were marched into a large, fenced-off recreation field where long wooden tables had been set up. They were visibly nervous, whispering to each other, their eyes wide with suspicion. In their experience, a special event organized by their captors was usually a prelude to something terrible. Bella stood on the edge of the field, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. She saw the cooks sweating over the pit, mopping the briskets with a tangy secret recipe sauce. She saw the American guards, Brody among them, standing with their arms crossed, their faces a mixture of resentment and curiosity. Then the food was served. The prisoners were herded into a line and given trays laden with portions of food so generous it seemed obscene. There were thick slices of smoky, fall-apart, tender brisket with a perfect pink smoke ring, piles of pulled pork, glistening and rich, scoops of creamy potato salad, and sweet, savory baked beans. They sat down and stared at their plates in stunned silence. This was not food as they knew it. It was primal, elemental. They had been raised on pasta, bread, and wine. This was a mountain of meat, cooked for hours over a slow fire, a testament to a culture of patience and abundance they couldn't comprehend. One prisoner, a young corporal named Enzo, who had been a stonemason in his village near Florence, cautiously picked up a piece of brisket. He sniffed it. He examined the dark, peppery bark on the outside and the succulent meat within. He took a bite. Bella watched his face. She saw the initial shock, the confusion, and then a slow wave of pure, unadulterated pleasure. His eyes closed for a moment. He chewed slowly, reverently. He had never tasted anything like it. The complex flavors of smoke, spice, and rich beef were a revelation. He looked at his friends, a wide, incredulous grin spreading across his face, and said something in rapid, excited Italian. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, the entire field was filled with the sounds of men eating with a gusto that bordered on desperation. They ate with their hands, sauce smearing their faces, their initial fear and suspicion completely forgotten, replaced by the simple, universal joy of a good meal. Bella watched them, and the wall of ice around her heart began to crack. She had expected to feel hatred, to see them as monsters gorging themselves. Instead, she saw a bunch of homesick young men, overwhelmed and disarmed by a simple act of American generosity. She saw their humanity, and it terrified her. As the meal wound down, Sergeant Brody walked over to her, his face dark with anger. "Look at 'em," he sneered. "Eating like kings. You look real proud of yourself, Rossi. Real proud of what you did for your people." "They're not my people, Sergeant," Bella said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're prisoners of war." "Yeah, well, you seem to have forgotten that," he shot back. He gestured toward the field. "This isn't feeding the enemy. This is fraternizing with them, and it's going to come back to bite you." He stalked off, leaving Bella alone with the lingering smoke and the confusing turmoil in her soul. She had done her duty, followed her orders. But in doing so, she had unleashed something she hadn't expected. The sweet, smoky taste of Texas barbecue had arrived at Camp Crockett, and it had brought with it the bitter, complicated taste of a truth she wasn't ready to face. The barbecue was more than just a meal. It was a psychological turning point. For the Italian prisoners, it was the first crack in the fascist propaganda that had shaped their lives. They had been told America was a collapsing nation, its people soft and starving. The reality of a single meal, the sheer, stunning abundance of it, was a more powerful counter-argument than any lecture or pamphlet. A slow, cautious curiosity began to replace their sullen defiance. For Bella, the barbecue marked the beginning of a subtle but profound internal shift. The clear, hard lines of hatred she had clung to since Jack's death began to blur. Seeing the prisoners as human beings with a capacity for simple joy had shaken her to her core. She buried her confusion in her work, her professionalism becoming an even thicker armor. She avoided any unnecessary contact with the prisoners, treating them with a cool, remote efficiency. The war, however, had its own demands. The vast ranches surrounding Camp Crockett were facing a severe labor crisis. With most of the young Texans overseas, there was no one to mend the endless miles of fences, repair the stone walls of the old corrals, or help with the autumn cattle roundup. The government, in a move that enraged many locals, authorized the use of Italian POWs as ranch hands. It fell to Bella to manage the logistics for these work details. It was a duty she dreaded, as it would force her into the very interactions she had been trying to avoid. One of the ranches in the program was the Circle D, a large spread of land belonging to a woman named Margaret Davis. Mrs. Davis was a formidable Texas matriarch, a widow who had run the ranch herself since her husband's death a decade prior. She was also a Gold Star mother. Her only son had been killed in North Africa. She had only agreed to accept prisoner labor out of sheer, desperate necessity. The first day the prisoners arrived at the Circle D, Mrs. Davis met the truck with a shotgun cradled in her arms, her face set like stone. Bella, who was there to oversee the deployment, felt a cold knot of apprehension. "Sergeant," Mrs. Davis said, her voice as hard as the baked Texas earth, "I want you to understand something. These men will work on the north pasture and nowhere else. They will not come near my house. They will not speak to me. If one of them steps out of line, I will not hesitate." Bella looked into the older woman's eyes and saw the same intractable grief that lived in her own heart. "I understand completely, ma'am," she said quietly. Among the prisoners assigned to the Circle D was Enzo, the young stonemason who had been so visibly moved by the barbecue. He and the other men were put to work repairing a long, crumbling stone fence that bordered the ranch. It was backbreaking work under the brutal Texas sun. But Enzo, for the first time in months, felt a flicker of his old self. He was a craftsman. Working with stone was in his blood. He handled the heavy rocks with a skill and an artistry that was beautiful to watch. He wasn't just piling them. He was fitting them, finding the natural seams, creating a structure that was both strong and elegant. Mrs. Davis watched from her porch, her expression unreadable. She had expected sullen, lazy work. Instead, she saw a master at his craft, rebuilding a piece of her heritage with a care she hadn't seen in years. A few weeks into the program, a fierce thunderstorm, common in that part of Texas, rolled across the plains with sudden violence. A bolt of lightning struck an ancient oak tree near the main ranch house, splitting it in two. A massive limb crashed down onto the roof of the spring house, the small stone building that protected the ranch's only source of fresh water. The roof collapsed, and the well was choked with debris. It was a catastrophe. By the time Bella arrived the next morning, the situation was grim. The well was unusable. Mrs. Davis stood by the wreckage, her usual iron composure gone, her face a mask of despair. It would take weeks to hire a crew to come out and fix it, and the ranch couldn't survive that long without water. Enzo and his crew, who had just arrived for work, saw the disaster. Without being asked, Enzo walked over to the ruined spring house. He carefully examined the collapsed stonework, his experienced eyes assessing the damage. He turned to Bella and spoke in his broken but determined English. "I fix," he said, pointing to himself and then to the other prisoners. "We stonemasons, carpenters, we fix." Sergeant Brody, who was supervising the detail that day, immediately intervened. "Get back to the fence, you!" he snarled at Enzo. "You're not touching anything else. You probably caused this, hoping for a chance to sabotage the well." But Mrs. Davis, who had overheard, stepped forward. She looked at the despair of her situation and then at the quiet competence in Enzo's face. "Let him try," she said, her voice raspy. "Ma'am, that's against regulations." Brody protested. "This is my land," she said, her voice regaining a spark of its old fire. "And that is my well. I say he can try." For the next 2 days, the Italian prisoners worked with a feverish intensity. Enzo directed the stonework, masterfully rebuilding the collapsed walls. Another prisoner, a carpenter from Naples, designed and built a new, stronger roof. They cleared the debris from the well, shoring up the sides and restoring the flow of clean water. They worked not as prisoners, but as craftsmen, their pride in their skills overcoming their circumstances. On the evening of the second day, the job was done. The springhouse was not just repaired. It was stronger and more beautiful than it had been before. Mrs. Davis walked out to inspect the work, her face a study in disbelief and gratitude. She turned to Enzo, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She couldn't find the words. Instead, she went back to her kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a pitcher of ice-cold lemonade and a plate of still-warm cookies for the entire work crew. It was a simple gesture, but it was an armistice in the private war she had been waging. When Bella heard the story, she felt a profound sense of hope. It was a confirmation of what she had begun to suspect, that beneath the uniforms, beneath the politics and the hatred of war, lay a shared and resilient humanity. Brody, however, saw the incident as the ultimate act of betrayal. He saw the lemonade and cookies not as a gesture of gratitude, but as dangerous fraternization. His obsession with proving Bella's disloyalty intensified. He began shadowing her, documenting her every move, twisting every act of professional duty into a sign of conspiracy. His chance came a week later. A small fire broke out in a storage shed at the far end of the camp, a shed that contained, among other things, old records and excess supplies. The fire was quickly extinguished and the damage was minimal, but the word sabotage was on everyone's lips. An investigation was launched immediately. Brody made his move. He went to the investigators and presented his evidence. He reported that he had seen Sergeant Rossi near the shed the night before the fire, in a suspicious conversation with the prisoner, Enzo. He produced a small, empty can of American lighter fluid that he claimed to have found near the scene. It was a flimsy, circumstantial case, but in the paranoid atmosphere of the camp, it was enough. Bella was summoned by Captain Harris. The accusation was laid out before her. It was her word against a decorated combat veteran's. Her Italian heritage, her professional but detached demeanor, her quiet defense of the prisoner's rights, it all painted a picture that was easy for the investigators to misread. "I am ordering you confined to your quarters, pending the outcome of this investigation," Captain Harris said, his voice heavy with regret. "I hope you understand, Sergeant. I have no choice." As the military police escorted her from the office, she saw Sergeant Brody watching from the end of the hall. He wore a look of pure, malevolent triumph. He had finally cornered her. The fire he had set had worked perfectly. Confined to her small Spartan room, Bella felt the walls closing in. The investigation was a sham, a foregone conclusion shaped by Brody's lies and the investigators' lazy prejudice. She was an easy scapegoat. Her career was over, and a court-martial and a dishonorable discharge seemed inevitable. For the first time since Jack's death, she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of despair. But as the days passed, the despair slowly burned away, leaving behind the hard, cold core of her character, a stubborn, unyielding refusal to be defeated by injustice. She was a quartermaster. Her mind was trained to see patterns, to track details, to find order in chaos. She would not be a victim. She would be an investigator. She replayed every detail of the fire in her mind. It wasn't the work of a professional saboteur. It was too small, too contained, almost symbolic. It was designed not to cause real damage, but to cause suspicion. It was designed to frame someone. And there was only one person with the motive to frame both her and the prisoners, Sergeant Walt Brody, proving it was another matter. It was his word against hers. She needed more than a theory. She needed irrefutable proof. She needed to get inside his head, to understand his habits, his prides, his weaknesses. And then she remembered the barbecue. Brody, like many Texans, was fiercely proud of his barbecue skills. He had often boasted in the mess hall about his secret family recipe for barbecue sauce, a recipe he claimed had been passed down through generations. He was a man who paid obsessive attention to the details of his craft. That pride, she realized, could be his undoing. Her plan began to form, a desperate, long-shot gamble that relied on her knowledge of the camp's supply chain and Brody's own arrogance. From her confinement, she was still allowed to review and sign off on routine supply inventories. It was a small, bureaucratic loophole, but it was the only weapon she had. She put in a special, unusual requisition. It was for a small, expensive crate of smoked paprika imported from Spain. It was a spice known for its deep red color and a unique, smoky flavor that was completely distinct from the standard domestic paprika used in the camp kitchens. She justified the requisition as a morale-boosting experiment for the officers' mess. The crate arrived a week later. Bella, under guard, was allowed to personally inspect and log the shipment into the main supply depot. As she did something no one saw. Using a tiny, almost invisible brush, she dusted the outside of the paprika container with a fine, colorless fluorescent powder, a substance used by Army intelligence to track sensitive documents. Then she made sure the crate was placed on a high shelf in the locked depot, a place that was technically off-limits but was known to be a frequent target for late-night procurement by NCOs with keys. And Sergeant Brody, as head of the camp guards, had a master key. The next step was to bait the trap. She called for the young private who served as a clerk in the supply office, a known gossip. She casually mentioned to him that the incredible Spanish paprika had arrived and that she was sad she wouldn't get a chance to cook with it. She knew the story of the rare, exotic spice would be all over the NCO mess within the hour. 2 nights later, her final hearing was scheduled. It was a formal proceeding, held in the camp's main meeting hall. Bella stood before a panel of 3 senior officers, her career hanging in the balance. Sergeant Brody was called to give his testimony. He was a confident, convincing witness, his voice ringing with false sincerity as he recounted his story of seeing Bella and Enzo near the shed, of his deep-seated fears for the camp's security. He was painting a masterpiece of deception. When he was finished, Bella was given a chance to speak. "Sirs," she began, her voice quiet but unwavering, "Sergeant Brody is a man of strong convictions. He is also a man of great pride, especially when it comes to his barbecue sauce." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Brody scoffed. "What does that have to do with anything?" "I believe the fire was not an act of sabotage by the prisoners," Bella continued, ignoring him. "I believe it was an act of arson committed by an American soldier designed to frame me and end a program he despised. And I believe the proof of his guilt can be found in his famous barbecue sauce." She turned to the presiding officer. "Sir, I request that the military police be dispatched to search Sergeant Brody's personal footlocker and bring back any containers of homemade barbecue sauce they find." The officers looked at each other, bewildered. The request was bizarre, unprecedented, but there was a cold, hard certainty in Bella's eyes that gave them pause. The senior officer, a colonel with a reputation for fairness, finally nodded. "Do it!" 2 MPs left the room. Brody sat sweating, a look of nervous fury on his face. 20 minutes later, the MPs returned. They carried a large glass jar filled with a dark reddish-brown sauce. It was Brody's pride and joy. "Now, sir," Bella said, "I ask that you have the lab test this sauce. I believe you will find it contains a very specific type of Spanish smoked paprika, a spice that was logged into our supply depot just last week." Brody leaped to his feet. "This is insane. I've never seen any Spanish paprika. My recipe is a family secret." "But that's not all, sir," Bella said, her voice rising with a new strength. She produced a small, handheld ultraviolet lamp. The container for that paprika was dusted with an invisible fluorescent powder. She walked over to the jar the MPs had brought in and handed the lamp to the colonel. "If Sergeant Brody handled that container to steal the paprika, the evidence will be on this jar." The colonel took the lamp, switched it on, and shone the eerie purple light onto the glass jar. And there, glowing with a brilliant, ghostly luminescence, were 2 perfect, incriminating fingerprints. A collective gasp went through the room. The silence was absolute. Brody stared at the glowing prints, his face ashen. He was caught. His own pride, his own obsession had been turned into a weapon against him. His carefully constructed world of lies and hatred collapsed in an instant. He confessed to everything, his voice cracking, his rage finally dissolving into a pathetic, self-pitying whimper. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Sergeant Brody was arrested. The Italian prisoners were exonerated, and Sergeant Bella Rossi was given a public apology and a battlefield promotion to lieutenant. A few weeks later, as the Texas autumn began to cool the air, the prisoner work program was reinstated. Bella, now Lieutenant Rossi, drove out to the Circle D ranch. She saw Mrs. Davis talking and laughing with a group of the Italian prisoners as they worked to finish the new fence. Enzo saw Bella's Jeep and walked over. "Lieutenant," he said, a respectful smile on his face. "We heard what you did. You fought for the truth." "We all have to fight for what's right, Corporal," she said. She reached into a cooler in the back of her Jeep and pulled out 2 cold glass bottles. They were Cokes. She handed one to him. He took it, his eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. Bella looked out at the vast Texas landscape, so different from the Italian mountains where she had lost the love of her life. The grief was still there, a scar on her heart, but it was no longer a fire. It was a memory she could now live with. She had honored Jack's memory, not by embracing hatred, but by choosing justice, integrity, and a difficult, complicated, and resilient humanity. She took a long drink of her Coke. The sweet, bubbly taste was the taste of her country, a taste of freedom, and for the first time in a very long time, it was the taste of peace.